Okay guys, so I'm going to make a video on the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, so the CNS and the PNS. This is going to be the last video for our nervous system unit, so it's going to cover pretty much everything within the central and the peripheral nervous system and all the needs that you will need to know. So first off, like I said, the nervous system, it's broken up into two kind of main subsystems, one being the central nervous system, which consists of your brain and your spinal cord. Your brain, when you think of your nervous system, your brain and your spinal cord are probably the ones that you think about the most when you think about the nervous system. They're central, so that's why we call them the central nervous system. They're what kind of everything revolves around. Now, the second division of the nervous system is called the peripheral nervous system, and this guy pretty much has all of the nerves that exist outside of the central nervous system. So like nerves that are sensory neurons that are carrying signals towards your brain, that's how you sense your environment, or the motor neurons that allow you to respond to the senses that you kind of took in. So the sensory receptors told you something happened, and the way that you can respond to it is by your motor neurons. Now, if we were to kind of break it down into an org chart, you would see the nervous system, like I said, is broken up into two main subcategories, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. Now, within the peripheral nervous system, we have some other subgroups. One being the autonomic nervous system, so that's a subcategory of the peripheral, and the other one is what we call the somatic nervous system, so autonomic and somatic. Now within the autonomic, we can break that down even further into what we call the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic. We're going to talk about these two later, but just remember that they are even a subcategory of autonomic, which is a subcategory of peripheral. So that's kind of how the flow chart works. So first off, we can't talk about the nervous system without talking about the most basic unit of it, the neuron. Now, neurons are cells that are specialized in transmitting and receiving messages, which is how your brain literally communicates with each other. Now, some of the features that you should be aware of within your neuron, you have these things called dendrites. These dendrites are these little hair-like fibers that are hanging out on the side. Dendrites are what conduct impulses towards the cell. So understand, this is the cell body. This is the kind of the main hub of the cell, and these dendrites literally take in sensory information and impulses from other places, and they direct it towards the cell body, okay? So it's coming in. Now, like I said, the cell body is kind of the hub of the neuron, and it contains the nucleus and the organelles. Just like we would think a normal cell would have, that's what's found in the cell body. And the final component of the neuron is something that we call the axons. Now, the axon is this very, very long tail-like structure you see coming off of the cell body, and the axon is really what conducts impulses away from the cell body. So the impulses will go down here, they'll come in through the dendrites, and they'll go out through the axon. So how do they send signals? How do these neurons conduct these impulses? Well, nerve signals are actually conducted based on electrical impulses that are sent down the entire length of the neuron. Now, how it all happens is first starting out by a stimulus. In order for a nerve impulse to begin to be propagated, it requires a stimulus from either one neuron or another neuron that's coming in and communicating with another neuron, or from one of the senses. It has to have some sort of stimulus to begin to work. So this whole transmission process is something that we call synapse signal transmission. Now, what a synapse is actually a gap between axons and dendrites of two neurons. So you see kind of like this little gap region between the axon and the dendrite of the next cell. If we kind of zoom in from here, here's the axon of one cell, here's the dendrite area of another one, and this is what it would look like, axon on dendrite. And this whole little like gap region in there, as you can see, they never touch, is what we call that synapse. That whole junction between the two is a synapse. Now the actual space in between there, we call it the synaptic cleft. But the entire junction, we call it the synapse. Now, through there, okay, neurotransmitters are actually going to be released from the axon. So you see all of these little vesicle green bubbles? Well, they hold a bunch of different neurotransmitters that will eventually be released into that synaptic cleft in order to propagate the message to the next neuron. Now, the dendrites, like I said, of the next neuron, they have receptors on there, which you see on these little purple circles, and these receptors are then stimulated by those neurotransmitters that are kind of hanging out in the synaptic cleft. They can bind to the receptors on there, on the dendrite, and then that will signal to the dendrite, hey, this axon is communicating with me, so now I need to pass the message along. Kind of like a game of telephone. You get the message and then you propagate the message to your friend and things like that. It's very similar as the way that neurons talk to each other. So how does it look like in the terms of electricity? Because I said it's an electrical impulse. Well, it's something called neuron polarization. Now, neuron polarization, it starts out in various phases. So the first phase is something that we call the resting neuron. So it is where there are more positive potassium ions, okay, inside rather than outside. So I know that it says that the potassium ions are positive and the sodium ions are positive. By the way, K plus means potassium, Na means sodium. Yes, that's talking about the ion itself. It's not talking necessarily about the charge, though. So don't be confused just because you see a positive by both of these. That doesn't mean that where they hang out is necessarily positive. Because if you look at this diagram, on the inside of the axon, it's actually a negative region. And this is where more of the potassium is at. It's actually negative inside the neuron, okay? And where the sodium is, outside of the axon, okay, outside of here, hanging out is more sodium, and it actually gives that the axon on the outside a more positive feel. So we start out with negative, and on the inside, positive on the outside. So the actual negative rating is about negative 70 millivolts. So that's what the inside is at. It's at a resting of a negative 70 millivolts. Now, this results, like I said, in an overall negative charge across that cell membrane on the inside. This is in the resting, so now we're going to move into this new thing called depolarization. Now remember how I said in order to propagate a message you have to get a stimulus? Well, that stimulus will then cause, usually over time, if you get enough stimuli, it will cause a depolarization to take place. Now what does that mean? That simply means that you have caused enough electrical impulses to come in and trigger what we call this thing called an action potential. And pretty much what's going to happen is through various leak gates, channels, you're going to see the sodium on the outside of that axon begin to rush into the inside of the axon. So when it rushes in, it's going to cause a overall positive charge. So that means if we started out at negative 70 millivolts in the inside, and now all of a sudden I'm just adding massive amounts of positive charge to that negative 70, well then I'm going to start getting more positive. So as you depolarize, you get more positive on the inside of the cell membrane. Like I said, it overall results in an overall positive charge across the inside of the cell membrane. Once the nerve pulse actually begins, it will travel along the entire length of the axon. So it won't just stop midway. It will take it through the full length of the axon. Once you get started, you can't stop. Now, there's a process called repolarization. So if we have resting potential and we have depolarization, then we have to have repolarization with an R. Now, this is where all of the charges return to their original state. So it returns, the potassium returns to where it's supposed to be, the sodium returns to where it's supposed to be, and we go back to, we're starting our way back down the number line back down towards that negative 70 where our resting is at. So we're creeping back down. Now, the overall result is the nerve cells is a negative charge. So as we repolarize, we're trying to make that inner membrane more negative again. So we went from being negative to depolarizing and becoming positive to now repolarizing and trying to become more negative again so that we can start back at ground zero. So it goes negative, positive, negative. Now, in order to get this to actually work, you need to have this thing called a sodium-potassium pump. So this is what allows those ions to go back to their original positions and to restore that gradient, that electrical gradient. Now, it is an active transport, meaning that it does require ATP. So this sodium and potassium pump requires ATP in order to move back the sodium and the potassium to their original positions. Let's talk about reflexes. So many of you guys have gone to the doctor and have probably seen something like this, of them hitting you on your kneecap with like this little hammer or this little mallet. They're checking your reflexes. So what is a reflex? Well, a reflex is a rapid involuntary response to a stimulus. So it is special because it doesn't necessarily require processing in the brain. So pretty much what it does is it goes and it gets sent from wherever you had the reflex happen. It will send it up to the spinal cord and then back down to wherever the actual thing occurred. So it completely bypasses the brain. Your brain doesn't have to think about your reflexes. It just happens automatically. So what does that look like? Well, we call it the reflex arc. Now, the reflex arc begins with a stimulus, like me having a pin shoved into my skin. Ow. It's going to stimulate my pain receptors, my nociceptors, okay? And it's as it gets sensed, I get it sensed by this thing called a sensory neuron. So a receptor inside, okay, of my pain, one of my pain receptors will pick up that signal, that pricking of my skin, and it'll send that message off to a sensory neuron. Now, the sensory neuron will become depolarized, remember, because it's getting a stimulus. It requires an action potential. All those neurons, that's how they propagate their message. And it's going to send a message now via this action potential down its axon. Now, what happens is it's going to reach the spinal cord. Here's just a cross-section of the spinal cord. And when it reaches the spinal cord, it's going to tell the spinal cord, hey, we need to send some responses to that area that just got jabbed. So pretty much how it's going to go from from sensing to responding, we have to do a little middleman. All right. Now this middleman is something what we call an interneuron. It literally is just the inner portion between the sensory and what we call the motor neuron. So he's kind of the relay in between, and he's the one that's chilling inside of the spinal cord. All right. Now the interneuron will talk to the sensory neuron, and sensory neuron says, hey, your skin is being pricked. So then the interneuron will hook up with the motor neuron and say, oh, motor neuron, guess what? Your skin is being pricked. You probably should remove that pin. And then the motor neuron is what sends that message out to a muscle or to wherever to tell you, hey, move your hand. So, like I said, your signal is then passed across that synapse, into that spinal cord, and to that interneuron, to the motor neuron. Now, once it gets out of that motor neuron, it hits what we call an effector. Now, an effector could be a muscle, it could be a gland, it could be an organ, it could be whatever. It's what is ever being moved based on that motor neuron stimulation. So like I said, in the event that it was a reflex like your knee or something, it's probably because one of your muscles contracted in response to that reflex arc. Now, reflexes may occur with skeletal muscles, like moving your hand away from a hot plate, something like that. Or it can also happen with your smooth muscles, like a process called peristalsis. Now, peristalsis is simply just the movement of muscles, very involuntary. It kind of is like an inchworm crawling up a tree. It inches its way down. So peristalsis, especially in your small intestine or in your esophagus, it moves food down by literally muscle contracting and like moving it down, sliding it down. And this is that action of peristalsis. Which brings me now to the portion of our brain. The brain as we think about it all the time. So our brain is very complex. It has lobes and things in it. It also has various areas I want you to be aware of. Couple of things I want you to know. We have the primary motor cortex. We have the premotor cortex. We have the Broca's area. We have the olfactory area. We have the visual area, auditory area. All these areas are found in our brain where all of our senses kind of get sent to. Once we've sensed them, it's sent over to the brain to process. So what do I want you to know? Well, first off, you have two cerebral hemispheres, okay, collectively known as the cerebrum. So this colored picture down here with all of those different colors, that entire big portion of the brain, the largest portion of your brain, is what we call the cerebrum. Now, like I said, it's consistent of two regions. So you have the left and the right region, and they make up the majority of your brain mass. So if you were to weigh somebody's brain, most of its weight is coming from the cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum is then divided into different regions based on the function of what's happening within your five senses. Before we get into that, let's just talk about left versus right. So in the parietal region, the parietal lobe of your brain, you have these two cortexes you should be aware of, the motor cortex and the sensory cortex. Now, these guys are found on both sides of your brain, but the big ticket is the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body, and the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. And the way that they do it is based on the way that these sensory receptors and neurons and things like that get pumped up to the brain, and it's just the way that they get processed. Now, people have said that you can be different types of personality, kind of depends on which side of your brain that you use more of. So they say that the left brain functions, kind of deals with a lot of scientific skills, some language, some reasoning, number skills, things like that. While the right brain is a little bit more insightful, more art, more music awareness, things like that. So there are a lot of times that you'll hear people call each other like, oh, you're my left brain, or you're my right brain, or something like that, or you're a right brain person. This is what they're referring to. Now, within the cerebrum, there's a lot of brain activity when it deals with your hearing, your seeing, and your speaking, like we saw in the Five Senses PowerPoint lecture. Now, as you can see, if I took an MRI scan of a person while they were hearing something, while they were seeing something, while they were speaking something, I would notice that different regions of my brain are going to have more activity than others. Like you see in hearing, I'm going to be around this lobe called the temporal lobe. When I see seeing, I'm going to be closer to the back on this occipital lobe. And then when I'm speaking, I'm going to be kind of closer to the front. Which brings me to this frontal lobe. This frontal lobe is the very forefront of the cerebrum, and the frontal lobe really controls movement. It controls language, higher order thinking. It deals with judgment and memory. Sometimes it kind of helps with some of that working through problems. Then that brings me to the temporal lobe. Now the temporal lobe, it contains the auditory, taste, and olfactory areas. Now we learned about taste, auditory, and olfactory areas in our five senses. Remember, that is sound, taste, and smell. And these guys are all interpreted in the temporal lobe, which is on the side of your brain. The parietal lobe. Now the parietal lobe, it integrates a lot of sensory information, which again is located right there, kind of right after you hit that frontal lobe. Occipital lobe. Now the occipital lobe is at the very, very back of the head, and its job is to contain the vision center, so to kind of process what you're seeing. Now within your cerebrum you also have layers, protective layers of course, and you have two layers kind of matter. The first is the outer layer called the gray matter. As you can see, if you look at this brain, it kind of has a gray-like outline. The gray matter actually contains the neuron cell bodies. So the cell bodies, okay, are the ones that give it the gray matter its grayish color. So that's pretty much looking at all of the neurons and their cell bodies just kind of lined up around in a cluster is what makes the gray matter. Now the other one, the inner portion, is what we call that white matter. Now white matter, it contains glial cells and the axons of neurons. Now if you remember from our axons, when we were looking at neurons, some of them had myelin sheaths around them. They kind of look like little marshmallows shoved around the axon. This is what's giving that white coloration to the white matter, all right, because it's containing all the axons. And just so you guys know, glial cells are actually supporter cells. So they kind of support the neurons. They kind of are like the little daycare nursery people who take care of the babies at a nursery. So they're kind of like support cells to the neurons. Now, if we look at the inner portion of the brain and we dissected it, we're going to find a couple of areas. Number one, we're going to find this thing called the corpus callosum, which we'll talk about in a second. We're going to find the thalamus and the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the pons, the medulla oblongata, the cerebellum, lots of inner functions of the brain. Now, this thing called the diencephalon, it's the region of the brain that is directly on top of the brainstem, and it's actually within the cerebrum. Now, the diencephalon has many features. It contains certain ones that I just talked about. It's kind of like a collective group of all of these ones. It contains the thalamus, which transfers impulses from sensory neurons into their correct region. So when you perceive things, when you sense things, they have to be sent through the thalamus to get redirected to the various lobes of your brain. It also contains the hypothalamus, which controls homeostasis from like temperature, water balance, metabolism. All of these things are controlled by the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is then connected to this thing called the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is what releases lots of trophic hormones, like what are important for puberty or for metabolism and things. Also for women's cycles, like luteinizing hormone and gonadotropin and stuff like that. All sorts of various hormones, and which leads me now to the brainstem. The brainstem attaches the brain directly to the spinal cord. And it contains a couple of features. Number one is the pons. And the pons is what actually contains neurons that are responsible for controlling breathing. It also contains the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is the lowest part of the brainstem, and it merges into the spinal cord and helps with, like I said, the controlling of your it helps with the controlling of your heart rate, things like that. That are really important for involuntary functions of your body. Now the cerebellum, or what we call the little brain, it kind of looks like cauliflower hanging out on the back of your cerebrum, and the cerebellum is what coordinates body movements. So a lot of that fine and coarse and crude body movements that you have, a lot of it is controlled by that cerebellum. Now, within the central nervous system, we have to have some protection. It's necessary. And the way that we are protected are by a couple of things. Number one is the bone, your skull. Number two are these things called meninges, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, meninges. Now, meninges are really just connective tissue that is covering the central nervous system. So the best way I can describe it is like wrapping your brain in saran wrap. If you would think that your brain is literally wrapped in saran wrap before you go and put it into your skull, that's pretty much what you would think a meninge looks like. Now, the thickest and outermost layer of the meninge, by the way, there are 3 of them. So the last layer, the one that touches the skull, is what we call the dura mater, which is that outermost thickest layer. Dura mater in Latin means one tough mother. So just remember, it's the thickest and it's probably one of the toughest layers of the meninges. The next is what we call arachnoid matter. Now, arachnoid matter is like a web-like network of blood vessels that are all just kind of on the brain. They help with some of the nourishment of the brain cells, things like that, but it's really just a bunch of blood vessels just kind of coating the entire surface of the brain. And then the last but not least is the innermost layer, and probably the one of the thinnest is what we call the pia mater. Now, if you put them all together, okay, you are going to get an acronym called DAP. Or, a lot of people hear it DAP, but I like to think about it from moving from the inside of the brain out. And if you move from the innermost layer of the meninge and you move out, it spells PAD. Pia mater, arachnoid matter, and dura mater, the PAD. Now, another helpful protective measure that the central nervous system goes through is something called cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is really similar to plasma, and it circulates throughout the entire series of the cavities called ventricles. So all these cavities that are throughout your brain are classified as ventricles, and this cerebrospinal fluid kind of gets sent through these ventricles in order to kind of help eliminate and get rid of waste, as well as kind of supply some nutrients. It also is used as a shock absorber because it's kind of like a watery, cushiony substance that protects the nervous system from any trauma in the event that you kind of smacked your head on something. The other one is what we call the blood-brain barrier. Now, this guy is made out of a lot of capillaries. This is where we get a lot of that blood supply to the brain, is through the blood-brain barrier. Now, it's called a barrier for a reason, because all it allows through it, usually, is water, glucose, and amino acids. So it's usually really good about keeping out all of the things that you actually ingest. It only takes what it needs, and it makes sure that nothing else can get through. The only thing that can, well, not the only thing, but probably one of the things that can pass the blood-brain barrier is something that is what we say is lipid-based in its composition. In its composition. It's lipid-based, so it can surpass the blood-brain barrier and get into your brain. So this can cause, of course, lots of problems. Another one is alcohol. Alcohol can actually pass the blood-brain barrier and cause the same thing, which is why you feel very kind of hallucinating, or not maybe hallucinating, but just very drunk when you drink a lot of alcohol, because you're starting to affect the brain. Okay, so the spinal cord really is just a continuation of the brain stem, and it takes you all the way from the top of your nape of your neck towards the pelvis region, towards the bottom. Now, its protective barriers from the brain include the bone, that's kind of what we call our spinal column, and then, of course, the meninges. The meninges are actually found also in the spinal region, so they're kind of not only covering the brain, but they're actually wrapping around the spinal cord as well. Now, you have 31 pairs of nerves that leave the spinal cord, and these guys are what connect to various organs and muscles and things like that. Now, I will not make you remember all 31 of them. I just want to let you know that that is what is there. So let's talk about some disorders. First off is encephalitis. Now, encephalitis is really an inflammation of the brain that's caused by a foreign substance such as a virus or something that's coming in there and is causing the brain to begin to swell. Some symptoms of this are headaches, drowsiness, nausea, and fever. And then we can also have another disorder called meningitis. Guess what it affects? Well, it's inflammation of the meninges. So an inflammation of those membranes that surround the brain, and if they swell, well, then that will add pressure onto the brain. As you can kind of see in here, we have bacterial, this kid has bacterial meningitis, and you can just see how inflamed his brain is, pushing up against the walls of the cranium. Some symptoms for this one is usually fever or very, very stiff neck. There's many forms of meningitis. There's viral meningitis, and there are bacterial meningitis, so just be aware that it is around. Alzheimer's. Now, Alzheimer's is actually it's a degenerative disease that causes usually a gradual loss of neuron cells, and it kind of just eats away at the brain, as you can see based on these two pictures that I'm showing you on the side. Now, if somebody has Alzheimer's, it tends to affect their new memories the most versus maybe some of their older established ones. So that can be, I guess, a good thing and a bad thing. Maybe a bad thing if you're trying to have a conversation partner. Maybe a good thing because now they have all their memories before this particular date. So it's kind of like they can live a legacy in their own minds. Now, what are some of the causes of Alzheimer's? Well, they're really unknown. We're not very sure. All right, CJD. CJD is actually the equivalent of what we call mad cow disease. So it's a human version of mad cow disease. And really what it's caused by are these things called prions. They're literally protein gone bad. They've refolded into this bad boy protein and is now causing mass havoc on your brain. Now, eventually what happens if you get kind of a mad cow disease is you gradually cause small holes to appear in your brain tissue, which literally are like eating away at your brain tissue. And if they eat enough of it, well, then you're going to have a lot of brain problems. Brain tumors. Now, brain tumors are, some of them can be really difficult to remove because of the way that they're positioned, also the way that some of them don't have the right treatments for it. Now, symptoms can vary depending on where you have the tumor. So, depending on which lobe it's found in, you can actually have variability. Another disease is what we call multiple sclerosis, or maybe MS, you've heard it. It's an autoimmune disorder where literally your body begins to attack the myelin sheaths that are surrounding your axons, causing you to literally have a delay in some of your signals that are being transferred. Now, these sheaths, pretty much what these myelin sheaths do is they serve as an insulation for axons, and they also help with the nerve speed crossway. So if I'm destroying those, well, then my neurons are going to kind of slowly get to their definition, or more slowly than what they did, which gives me a delay in understanding something. Now, some of the symptoms are degeneration of various senses like vision and touch. Also, muscle weaknesses, sometimes depression is a key characteristic for it. Another one is stroke. Now, stroke occurs when a blood clot or a ruptured vessel interrupts the blood flow for a particular part of the brain, which can happen quite honestly. Now, the brain cells in that area that don't get the oxygen, they begin to die, causing that permanent damage to happen within the brain. It's pretty much the brain's equivalent of a heart attack. So heart attacks and strokes are different. Heart attacks affect the heart, strokes affect the brain. Which brings me now to our peripheral nervous system. So that's different, of course, than our central one. Remember, if you don't remember, look back at the beginning of the video where I put that org chart. Now, the peripheral nervous system, it includes neurons that are outside of the brain and the spinal cord. And these neurons are usually sensory neurons, meaning that they sense the environment, or motor neurons, where they kind of put into place based on, or they put into action based on their sensory. They also have cranial nerves in the peripheral nervous system. These cranial nerves kind of deal with some stuff with specifically in the cranium. And then spinal nerves, same thing, that deal with things that are very specific in the spinal cord. So here are some of the cranial nerves that you guys may see. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves from head into neck that are attached to the brain directly. They usually bypass the spinal cord because they are for cranial nerves. They're for the cranium. Some of these nerves you may already kind of know because they sound really familiar. The first one is olfactory. This guy is a sensory neuron. It's a sensory perception. You know this because of smelling. The next one is optic, which is vision sensory. Also the ocular motor. The ocular motor, believe it or not, is for your eye. It's eye muscles that are found within your eyes, so it's a motor function. Just trochlear. The trochlear is for eye muscles as well. It's a motor function. Just so you know, there's lots of things for the eyes because it makes up about 70% of our total neuron mass. The trigeminal. The trigeminal is facial muscles that are dealt with merely on usually sensing things. Also, it could be a motor function based on chewing gum. So you use muscles in your face when you're chewing gum. The next one is the abducens or the abductions. These guys are the eye muscles. They deal with motor responses for your eye muscles. The next one is the facial muscles. Now these guys usually deal with taste, or facial muscles sensing necessarily with motor. So tasting is more sensory, facial muscles is motor. And the vestibular ocular, this guy is dealing with balance and hearing. So it's definitely a sensory. The glossopharyngeal, this guy is dealing with taste and with swallowing. And of course the vagus, which is probably the most common one, or not the most common I shouldn't say, but the most popular one. It deals with sensory and motor neurons that are affected in sweating, peristalsis, heart rate, opening of the larynx for speech, things like that. The last two, one is going to be the accessory nerve, which deals with the upper back muscles and the neck, and the hypoglossal, which deals with your tongue. So those are all 12 of the cranial nerves. Now let's move into the spinal nerves. So the spinal nerves, there's actually 31 pairs of them total. I'm not going to ask you to know all of them. These are part of the autonomic nervous system, if you'll remember. Autonomic meaning that it's usually involuntary, so you're not really in control of it. Now, the autonomic nervous system includes all, like I said, the neurons that are controlled involuntarily. The parasympathetic nervous that come in underneath the autonomic nervous system. So remember, the autonomic nervous system is broken into two subcategories. One is called the parasympathetic nerves. Now, these guys tend to originate from the cranial and the sacral area of the central nervous system. These guys control rest and digest functions within the body. So, like salivation, tears, urination, digestion, defecation, and sexual arousal, all of these guys are subject to the parasympathetic nervous system. So here's an image. As you can see, it's up in the cranial region where some of the nerves are from, and then, of course, also in the sacral region where some of them are controlled. Which leads me now to the opposite one of the two, which is the sympathetic nervous system. Now, these guys tend to originate in the thoracic and the lumbar region of the spine. And these guys control fight or flight. So that means that you're always in adrenaline junkie mode. So it'll dilate your pupils, it will increase your heart rate, it'll activate sweat glands. You're kind of in that nervous / survival mode where your sympathetic nervous system has to kick in. So here's kind of a diagram, like I said, coming from the thoracic and the lumbar regions. Now, talking about the nerves, if we look very carefully of where we get that reception for these nerves, well, the first one is the olfactory nerve. Like I said, that deals with smell. So you will find the olfactory nerve attached to an olfactory tract and an olfactory bulb, as you see in the picture. Now, the olfactory, like I said, is used for smell, and in most animals, this olfactory nerve is actually elongated and enlarged. So, which is why some organisms can smell things a lot better than we can and really pinpoint it. The next is the optic nerves. Now, the optic nerves, these guys, here's some pictures, are responsible for your vision. So they're what allow you to actually see things. The optic chiasma is where these two nerves from both eyes come and separate. So the optic chiasma is kind of like a crisscross or a butterfly effect, which you can kind of see here. Here's that crossing over as the optic chiasma. Then that brings me to the ocular motor nerves. Now these guys, like I said, they control your eyes, your eye movement, so it helps with the muscles in your eyes. That leads me to the next, that is called the trigeminal nerves. Now these guys are the largest that we will see of all of the nerves. They deal with somatosensory information like touch and pain and things like that from your face and from your head and things of that nature. Now the vagus nerve is the one that I told you is the important one to kind of remember out of all of them. It is very thin threaded down the sides of the trachea. So guys, that is the end of my video for the central and the peripheral nervous system. If you have any questions, by all means, please come and see me. I would be happy to answer anything.